Right, hello everybody. I'm really sorry about the delay in getting to you, but I hope you're having a good evening and thank you for bearing with us. First things first, everybody, can we do a sound check just to make sure that uh, we are coming through to you loudish and clear-ish? This will it will take a few minutes. Yes, we had a bit of a problem with the older Wi-Fi and the system I was using for that. So we'll crack on. Welcome everybody. I'm so very glad to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Susan Major. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello, and just tell everybody, the audience, just a bit about yourself.
Can I first of all tell them what I'm drinking?
Oh yes, we'll do the beer.
I don't much like beer, but I do like fruit beers. And in fact, one of the local ones, of course, is Sam Smith's, who have their supporters and detractors, but their apricot beer is very nice. One of our local pubs, the Trafalgar Bay on Nunnery Lane, has been very helpful, and wearing my local history hub hat, the Trafalgar Bay have offered to be a local history hub for us in the next few months.
On the beer.
Right.
So a bit about yourself for the audience.
Yes. Well, unlike most of you, well, all of your other participants, I don't have a lifelong interest in railways. My interest, it probably dates back about 20 years. For the last half of my career, I've been a marketing manager, and we used to live in Poppleton, and I had a growing interest in local history, and I took part in a bit of research about the 150th anniversary of the local railway line. And that got me interested. And then as I was about to retire, I wanted to do a research degree. And I ended up, because it was York, doing one in railway history. And what I did was I used a diary that a local village wheelwright had kept. And it was a wonderful source of evidence because he'd kept it over the whole of the Victorian period from the 1830s till after the turn of the century. So I was trying to find out and explore what impact the railway had on his life and his family's life. And unusually, I used a geographical information system to try and plot that, a GIS. And that's something that historians tend not to use enough of, I don't think. So that's where I started off. And then my supervisor persuaded me to carry on and do a PhD. And I was still interested in working class travel, and I lighted upon the railway excursion as a suitable subject. Although, so that's one of my main railway interests, but more recently, I've done some work on women railway workers in World War II.
Mm-hmm. So, well, we'll talk about your books and offerings to the public a little bit later. But so, what was it about, working class? Was it something about the excursion that really captured your imagination?
Right. Yeah. Can we just have the next slide? That's it. Yeah. I was very keen on the impact of the railway on ordinary people. There's an awful lot of evidence about how the middle and upper classes moved around for leisure, but I was thinking of people, and it was actually the vast majority of people in the country, probably about 80%, ordinary people, working classes, didn't have much money and very little time. And I think if you if you watch television today and looked at programmes such as Michael Portillo, you'd think that what people used to do is ride around in their railway compartments with their Bradshaws in their hands, sitting very comfortably. And that's the image that's been projected in an awful lot of railway history books and certainly on television. And to me, it doesn't reflect how people used to travel. And I chose that period in the middle of the 19th century because it was quite unique. There was the travelling masses going around the country on their excursions, and it didn't happen in other countries for various reasons. For example, we were quite a small country, so people, you could get to your destination reasonably quickly. Well, when I say quickly, it could take several hours, but other countries were much bigger. Pay and holiday, pay was getting slightly better. Holidays were getting slightly better towards the end of the century. You're probably aware that other countries had a different system of railways. We relied on private sector investment, although I didn't find that necessarily made that much difference in terms of the development of excursions. Yeah. So it was a big watershed moment for railway, for working class. I felt as if I was digging a kind of archaeological trench through this period, from when people didn't have the railway through to when they did. And I discovered quite a lot of things that weren't reflected in railway history books. So I was determined to get them into a book. And what you can see there is my book that was published some years ago, a few years ago now, on early Victorian railway excursions.
And I would really recommend it to everyone.
Thank you.
No, it's a great book, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think my students enjoy it as well. So yeah.
Well, the important thing was that there was not much in the way of evidence. You know, it's very difficult to find evidence.
And of course, a lot of that evidence comes from sources not of the people themselves. And we will get into this, but they come from people observing.
Yes, that's right. First of all, you don't get railway companies doing lots of statistical returns about excursions. They just didn't do it. They didn't isolate those sort of journeys. A lot of working people were too busy working to actually have the time to write about what they'd been doing on these journeys. So there are very few memoirs, diaries. Obviously, a lot of people couldn't write anyway. Whereas what you do get is a lot of accounts by middle class travellers. So that meant you've got this image of what travel was like in the middle of the 19th century, but it didn't reflect the experience of the vast majority of the populace.
Yeah, and that's always been my feeling about sort of, you know, you see the compartment, but, you know, the idea that you could jump over the back of the seat into the,
Yeah, and there were very few business. Well, there's hardly any business archives that are relevant. We know there was a substantial Thomas Cook archive, and more about him later. And I think there were also very few images. I mean, it's quite difficult when you're putting together a talk about early railway excursions because you don't get many pictures.
And this one on the front of the book, and we'll talk about that a bit later, but that turns up quite a lot, doesn't it? Yeah.
It does. It's a lovely image, actually. It actually dates from about 1862, so that's a tiny bit later, but it's really evocative.
Yeah.
But the thing that I was able to use was contemporary press evidence. And of course, the time I started, which was, I'm trying to think, was it about 10 years ago? When you were looking in the contemporary press, you'd go to a library and look at a bound volume or a microfilm. And then just at that point, the British Library were progressing their programme of digitisation. So it was great in terms of looking at what was in the press about early excursions, because there it was digitised. Digitisation, of course, has its advantages and disadvantages, which I won't go into now, but I mean, there are pluses and minuses about that, but it's jolly useful for this sort of research, because people in the press, you'd get the adverts for the excursion, but you'd also get reports about what had happened, and you'd also get commentary about what the perspective was from the point of view of the person writing in the press. And I think the important thing was these excursions generated huge numbers of people. huge crowds, and that made them very noteworthy. So they did appear. The crowds were when they were setting off, when they were on the train, and you're talking literally about thousands of people on the train, and then at the destination. So can you give me the next slide?
Yes, absolutely. Oh, there you go. Oh, going back.
Yes. Oh, no, that's it. Yes. And yeah, this is a wonderful resource that I was able to use. These are a fairly rare collection of early excursion handbills that are in the Railway Museum. As you can see, they're not like the wonderful decorative, beautifully designed railway posters of much later on. The best you can hope for is a different coloured paper to make them more exciting.
And of course, all the different fonts. You know?
Yes, that's true. Yes. But what you do get, you get to know the name of the company, where they were going, where they're coming from, the price, the date, what they were willing to say about the trip. So they are a good resource. I did also find a few diaries, and another really good source was accident reports. And I know you've heard all about accident reports from Mike Espester with the Portsmouth project. His focus was on the worker, of course, whereas my focus is on the passenger. And you do get a lot of detail about what happened, some dreadful accidents. Excursion trains were very dangerous, particularly in the mid-1840s. And there were lots of awful accidents involving people's heads because they would climb onto the top of a carriage and not realise there was a bridge coming, or they would stick their heads out of a window, not realising there's going to be a metal stanchion sort of just outside the window. So you do get quite a lot of information from those reports. And then lastly, another source, an interesting source, is 19th century novels. For example, Wilkie Collins wrote about the congestion in one of his novels, a congestion at York Station. Thomas Hardy wrote a story. He wrote it at the end of the century, but he was reflecting 1851, a trip to the Great Exhibition in an open carriage, and the poor people, the women who arrived in London, absolutely perished cold. And what to me is quite interesting is, in order to protect themselves from the cold, they'd lifted the back of the skirts over the heads, so they were quite warm at the top but very cold at the bottom.
Right.
And then there's another writer, George Eliot, who's very interesting, and she pointed out in an essay in 1856. She pointed out what I'm pointing out now is that the travelling experiences of the masses at this time. And she said there were stock images of a Bradshaw, a station, and a train line, but wrote how little the real characteristics of the working classes are known to those who are outside them. And I think it's probably true today.
Yeah, I mean, this is a broader thing in history, isn't it? It's something that we've been dealing with 40 years, trying to change the conversation. We're not change the conversation. Well, yeah, actually change the conversation to sort of explore the lives of people who are not the wealthy, not the rich, not the articulate middle class, to try and get those experiences. And it's not always easy. So
yeah, the evidence is very, very rare.
Yeah.
And then I suppose what I'd like to do is go on to my first myth, which is really about the trajectory of travel. And I think it's partly what we were told at school. Either that ordinary people didn't travel hardly at all, or that they relied. We don't want this one yet.
Oh yeah, sorry.
No.
Sorry.
They relied on. There were stagecoaches, and then there were trains, and of course stagecoaches weren't for ordinary people. They were for people with money. It was a very middle class mode. But ordinary people either walked or they used carts, and those are things that don't leave records at all. So we don't generally know about that.
Yeah.
But you do see some evidence in some diaries, and I think we all know that there was an awful lot of permanent residential migration where workers moved from the countryside into town. But what I'm talking about is leisure travel, where somebody in their very limited time off work could go do something for leisure, could travel for leisure. But of course, because they only probably had one day off, if they had to walk or use a cart, it was their scope was very limited.
And that's. Are you aware of Huggins and Tolson's paper on sport? And they talk about how
Yes.
before the railways, people were walking a very long way to go to the races.
Yeah, well, I was going to mention that in terms of places like Blackpool, which was originally a rather sort of upmarket place, but then in the 19th century, when the working classes started to arrive, they would walk huge distances. They're walking 20 or 30 miles to get there, or they could be in a cart, and they would get there and they didn't have the money for the bathing machine, so they'd just strip off and run naked into the sea. So I think most people... I think they assume that the workers didn't really go anywhere, but that's not really true. So can we have the steamboat next?
I'll just say, anybody, while we change over, if anybody has a question, please do ask, and we'll try and answer them, and Susan will try and answer them, and we'll chat. But yeah, if you've got any questions, so Susan, Eastern Railway Excursion.
Yeah, this is a precursor, if you like, of the railway excursion. It's a steamship trip. And this particular one, sorry, there's a spelling error on the caption. It's Blackheath and Greenwich in 1847, and these were very popular. There's different classes of travel in them, but it looks to me from this particular illustration there's quite a mixture of people, but they were obviously very sort of smoky. But they were very, very popular, particularly obviously if you live near a big river or near the sea. And they were the start of something, and it was the early 19th century when you got your first steamboat trips, and by the 1840s they were very popular. So what I was looking at the middle of the 19th century, and this was a time when there was a dramatic increase in railway lines, especially in England. So if you could show the next slide.
Yes, the growth of the network.
That's right. The first one is 1840, then we've got 1850 and 1872. And you can see in 1840, you've got a fair number of lines, but not that many, between London, the northeast, the northwest, Bristol, not a lot else going on. And then by 1850, you've got quite a lot more connectivity. Yeah. Not so good if you lived in Scotland or Wales or even Devon and Cornwall, but certainly in a lot of England, there was a fair amount of connection. It meant that for the first time, you could use a train to get to somewhere a darn sight quicker than in a cart or walking. And then, of course, by 1972, it was much more connected.
So you say 1875, there you've got 14,510 miles. So that's a staggering amount of railway by that point.
It's amazing, isn't it? And it was all done by private investments, of course.
And that's, I mean, just it gets to something like, what, 21,000 by the turn of the century? So that's not even 3/4 complete. So, yeah. No.
So what you had, there was this great potential for people to start to travel, and there were, I'll say a bit about how they were organised, but these journeys were quite often called cheap trips, and they usually cost either a few pence or a few shillings, and the important thing was that people could go away and come back the same day. They quite often only had one day off work, and again I'll say a bit about that. So they didn't have much scope to go anywhere, but it meant they could do this and come back. I mean, traditionally people had their leisure had included local fairs and wakes weeks and Whitsun and things like this, but this was something quite different. And it was also helped by, in 1842, the Railway Clearing House was established, which meant that it was much easier to arrange the through booking of journeys, which might have included often a connection of different lines. So that made quite a difference. And so these new excursions generated a very different kind of mobile crowd phenomenon. And it really transformed leisure for most working people. Sorry, next one.
Million go forth.
Yes, I love this phrase, and in fact I used it as a subtitle on my book. The masses, the working classes, were quite often referred to in the press as the million. It meant just a mass of people. And as you can see from this quote in 1853, the press were quite positive about the railway excursion, and they were very supportive, and emphasising the revolutionary effect. One thing here is that there was this big, I don't know how much you've covered this with your students, David, but there's this big rational recreation debate in the 19th century where middle-class reformers could see all the social ills that were abounding in society, and they wanted to do something about it. So they set up voluntary societies, and they were very keen to persuade the working classes to do some things and not others. For instance, they weren't at all keen on cruel sports, gambling, street games, drinking, but they were keen on baths, parks, libraries, and the railway excursion, which was good. But it's interesting when you look at it, because the upper classes were able to do all those naughty things in the privacy of their own home. So it was a bit discriminatory in terms of the working classes.
Yeah. Most students get, well, as we talked before, students will be getting certain papers on the course that I will no doubt talk to you about a bit later, and academic chapters. But yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, and what I've always found very interesting and fascinating about your work, Susan, is this idea that there are these social forces that really shape and craft the nature of excursion. And no doubt we'll get to this going on, but I just always found that interesting thing is just about bringing these social factors really into policy decisions, which might previously, in an academic era previously, have been seen as sort of just simply managerial organisational decisions, but there's this broader social context.
Yes, it's all so complex, and there's a lot of social construction going on, and I suppose it's a side of railway history I'm particularly interested in. Traditionally, the technology and the buildings have been the important thing, but I'm interested in the passenger and which forces were shaping the companies to make decisions about when those passengers could travel. I suppose I ought to just say that the railway excursion, the excursion I'm talking about, is a return trip at a reduced fare, basically. You sometimes get books which talk about railway excursions, but they're actually middle-class writers talking about their jaunts. They're not talking about what I would say are an excursion, a cheap trip.
Yeah.
And those trips could be organised either solely by a railway company or by a company acting in concert with either an excursion agent or a group, a Sunday school or a mechanics institute or a friendly society. It could be trips where you either go for the day or you stay or you come back on another day, but that has implications for what happens with where you stay overnight, because that's money.
Yeah.
There were
We have a not so much a question but a comment from Phil, who sort of says it must have been very profitable for the railway companies that ran them.
The profit was varied, really. So, one of the problems was that some companies were not very keen at all, because it held up their other traffic. If you got a huge train with thousands of people, and it also meant that if an excursion train was going somewhere else, it wasn't available for normal traffic in another place. So the companies themselves couldn't quite work out whether they were profitable or not, and so they didn't actually put investment in the infrastructure that they should have done, really. So they used I'll go on to say what they did use, but they used ropey old trains and wagons. The stations were nowhere big enough for the excursion train. You'd have a huge long excursion train with literally thousands of people, and because the station only had a relatively short platform, in some cases the excursion train would actually be parked on the top of a viaduct, and sometimes people tried to get off. So there were all sorts of other things happening.
Crikey. Where's he gone? I don't know where he's gone. Oh, no. Sounds a bit dangerous, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There were lots of timing issues, and I haven't got time to go into them today, but I'll mention a couple. One is Sunday trips. Don't forget, at this time of year, at this time of the century, people were working, say, from 6 in the morning till, say, 6 days a week, and they had Sundays off. But the Sabbatarians were saying we can't possibly have leisure on a Sunday because they're not in, it's a wrong. So they encouraged railway companies not to run Sunday trips. Some did, some didn't. So that was a big problem. And it also, the Sabbatarians also, if they heard of a Sunday trip, they would always be very critical of the behaviour. And if you look at other accounts of behaviour, you can see how the Sabbatarians used criticism to try and distort the perspective of what was happening on these trips. The other thing was, and something which I've written about several times, is the idea of Saint Monday. Now, some of you will know about Saint Monday and others won't, but it's this idea that a skilled craftsman has got the power over his employer to say, I'm not going to come in on Mondays because I do as much work the rest of the week to get it done, and therefore I'll take Sunday and Monday off. So Sunday, Saint Monday, was very much a holiday day on a regular basis in quite a lot of parts of the country over much of the century. It wasn't just Britain, it was in France as well, St. Lundy, and in Germany, Blauer Montag, and even in America. So it was just a sort of interesting thing. You can only do it, of course, if your employer needed you. If the employer could get somebody else to do your job, then you couldn't. And certainly in, say, Manchester, where it was all factories and mills, they couldn't afford for people to be having the staying off work because it would stop the machinery. So it was different in those sort of workplace settings. So going back to excursions generally, and I'll mention Thomas Cook later, but certainly probably the very earliest excursion was a Sunday school excursion as soon as the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened in 1831. So that was very early on, and the Sunday schools played a huge part in commissioning railway excursions because they had a ready market. Destinations, people will be aware of seaside resorts, that was very common, but you also had big towns, exhibitions, historic locations. I found one to Stonehenge. And interestingly, when people got to these places, they quite often had to walk miles to get to the actual attraction. And then there was race meetings and military musters. I've got a series of handbills to sort of so that you can see what's going on. This is the first one. This was 1841 Easter. This was a very old one. It's York and North Midland, I think, running trips from York to Leeds and Hull. And that was on Good Friday and Easter Monday, I think it was running. And that was 3 shillings third class to Leeds and back from York, 4 and 6 to Hull. And these were day trips, so that was a very early one. Show the next one.
Trips of Christmas, hurrah.
Yes, the next one was Christmas trips, and again, they were leaving Leeds and places around and coming to Hull, York and Scarborough. And what's interesting here, and in fact it was 2 and 6 from where was 2 and 6 from Leeds to York and back, more to Scarborough. These set off on Christmas Eve, and you could come back on Christmas Day. So the trains were running at these times. And this actually was an excursion agent in Leeds, Thomas. I think his name was Thomas Clapham.
Yeah.
Yeah. The next one. Yeah, this is the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, and it was a trip in Lancashire to Blackburn for Blackburn Park, and it was for a military review. And you could go from various other places in Lancashire, Colne, Nelson, Burnley, etc. And depending on where you were coming from, it would anything from 6p to 1 and 3 to go there and back. And I think it sort of illustrates people were very keen on spectacle. They didn't have cinema or TV, and anything that offered a spectacle was a real attraction. And this is a wit trip in 1863. Next one.
Sea bathing for the working
Yeah,
classes.
I think this is a sort of famous poster. Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway again, and this is actually a Sunday trip, and it was from Preston to places like Fleetwood and Blackpool, sea bathing for the working classes, and you might not be able to see it on here, but it actually says people will be able to bathe and refresh themselves in ample time to attend place of worship. That was the basis on which they were able to run these, arguing that people could still go to church and follow Sunday, even though they were on a trip. In fact, there's a little story about mill workers talking. The sea bathing was quite important because it got them clean. Because there's a story about two mill workers talking and saying, "By God, Bill, that's mucky," and the other chap says, "I missed a cheap trip last year." So it was quite important having a good douse in the sea.
Gordon has just said he loves the line. Was it in this one or the other one? All covered carriages.
Yeah, well, I'm going to talk in a bit about the covered carriages and the alternative, and it's something that was actually put in quite often on posters, covered carriages. But I will raise that. Thank you for bringing it up. I'm going to mention it a bit later on.
What's really interesting to me, though, here, and I don't know if you know, but the printer here is Bradshaw and Blacklock, 57 Brown Street, Manchester, which produced the Bradshaw's Guide, Blacklock being Bradshaw's partner. So,
right.
That's really interesting because, of course, aside here, Bradshaw left the company pretty much by that point. So, but it's just interesting to see they were doing other work aside from Bradshaw's Guide. Anyway.
Well, what I find interesting about the print of that poster is in two colours, because I don't think I've seen any others that were in two colours in that period.
Certainly the first one I've seen,
Yeah. And then there was a sort of ladder of respectability where you've got sort of trips to seaside resorts and big towns and exhibitions, and then you get things that are more likely to generate unruly crowds, such as prize fights. And this one here is on the Newcastle and Carlisle Railway, and you've got wrestling and the races, so that's a bit more sort of down market, if you like, and that was 5 shillings from Newcastle to Carlisle and back. People quite often ask about the prices and affordability. It's very difficult because in different areas of the country you got wildly different sort of rates of pay depending on what you're doing, and certainly the agricultural workers were the worst off. So you could be earning anything between about 15 shillings and probably 30 shillings a week in this period, depending on what you were doing. So even what looks like a low amount, 5 shillings, you'd almost certainly have to save up for. But that's what people did.
I mean, how much? I mean, maybe you know. I mean, I've got so I can see here it says it was produced on June the 17th, and it was for an excursion about 2 weeks later. So I imagine if you are someone who's going to buy a third-class travel, the company might want to get the notice out a bit early so that people could save, or
I mean there were lots of these. Well, there were lots of different kinds of excursion, of course, and in some cases where a friendly society or a club that might meet in a pub, they would have saved up for months, and they would probably commission the railway company, and certainly the Sunday school trips would. This one's more sort of open-ended, and I would certainly, I mean, people probably would be aware of it because it was the race meeting, so they would probably guess that there would be one coming on, even if the poster wasn't produced in plenty of time. There's lots of things that it's actually difficult to ascertain, really, because we just don't know.
Interesting. Gordon's commented that Henry Blacklock was a notable printer of railway timetables. He also printed for Bradshaw, but I've actually done a bit of research into this, and it seems that Blacklock was an apprentice of Bradshaw originally. So I think there's a very close relationship between. I think Blacklock deserves more of the credit for the Bradshaw success than Bradshaw does. But anyway.
Yeah. Oh.
Anyway, so next one, the reward. Yes.
Not yet.
Not
No,
yet.
just
Okay.
say something.
You had a big scary word in the middle of that one, so yes.
Disaster tourism. I mean, there were, sorry, no, but even before that, I talked about disreputable trips to hangings. Sadly, I don't have a poster of a trip to a hanging because I don't think they produced any, but there were lots of excursions to hangings at this time. For example, the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway laid on an excursion to York. From Accrington in Lancashire, because the murderer John Riley was being executed, and there were many thousands there watching. There was also disaster tourism. I found an example of a special trip from York to Home Firth in 1852, and a few people might be aware there was an awful flood in Home Firth that year, and so there was actually a special train to the scene of the flood. Now, it's not clear whether that was just people going to have a look or whether they had a more serious purpose, such as raising subscriptions to help people. But it reminds me of modern activity, because if you remember, there was almost a disaster at Whaley Bridge last year because of the reservoir, and they suffered from people coming to have a look. There was something similar in the 1960s when there was an awful plane crash near Stockport, and that the motorways were full of people making a special trip to go and see. So disaster tourism has always been a thing, sadly.
I mean, people slowing down for accidents, eh?
Yes.
Very.
I suppose it's only natural that
Wow.
not to see it reflected in the railway excursion. You can now show the one about hell.
Hell.
This is a famous poster. I haven't seen a better quality reproduction of it, but it was this reverend gentleman. He's actually a Scottish vicar, WJ Burns, who was one of the most vociferous of the Sabbatarians. He was mightily affronted at the idea of there being an excursion on the railway on a Sunday, and he said they would be taken safely and swiftly to hell. So that's just a bit of a side issue.
I mean, are you going to talk about the poem that I love? I think is. Oh, no, that's a different context, isn't it?
Is that not the line to heaven and hell?
The lines to heaven and hell, yes.
Yeah, well, I wasn't going to on this one, but I mean, I can mention it in passing that there was a famous song that the Sunday schools used to sing about the railway line, and the up line was to heaven and the down line was to hell.
It's one of my favourite things you turned up. I just love it. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah. I was going to go on to another myth, really, and it was more of a myth at the time. Yeah. The idea that the working classes in great number, if you got them in a crowd, they would form a riot. Yeah. Somehow they could be trusted to behave themselves. And these excursions generated the most enormous crowds. You could tell how popular they were, and so you might have, say, 3,000 people massing at a small station early in the morning to set off on their trip to London or wherever it was. They would be waved off by all their friends and family, so that made the crowd bigger. And then on the train, it would be a massive crowd, and then at the destination. So there was some concern, a bit problematic, and there would be a riot because they didn't know how to behave themselves, because the 1840s was a time of Chartist riots, plot riots, a lot of radicalism in that period. So that's why people thought that was a great danger. But actually, of course, it wasn't the case. And it became clear from the commentary in the press that they seemed to be quite surprised that these large crowds of ordinary people had behaved themselves. And that next poster, I think. This is a late-ish poster for the Great Exhibition in 1851. And again, that was quite a watershed moment for working class mobility. For a lot of people, they went to London for the very first time, probably the only time in their lives. And it was almost a mark that they'd been to London for a trip. And as you can see, the there was so much competition from the different railway companies to make it cheaper and cheaper to get the business. This one was 5 shillings, third class, from York to London and back. This was the Great Northern. In the end, they couldn't afford it really. The companies, it wasn't making them any money at all. But it was, when you look, something in the region of about 6 million people visited the Great Exhibition, a lot of working class folk, and it was the first time the middle classes had seen great crowds of ordinary people in great numbers, and they were surprised at their behaviour and any change in terms of perceptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you've got that whole era post, should we say, Peterloo and all of that, and you see that not just with excursions, but the general anxiety about the railway allowing people, all the working classes are moving around, and it's
yes.
So
there were worries.
Yeah.
I'm then going to go on to talk about the subject we raised earlier. So the next one is that, yes. Now, it's another myth, really, because I think anybody who knows about railway history will know that in 1844 there was the introduction of the parliamentary trains, which meant that there had to be at least one covered carriage train a day, and certainly trains were much more comfortable. There was a lot of improvements of third class travel after that point. So I think people assume that after the mid-40s that you didn't actually get open carriages. But of course that wasn't the case for excursions. And in fact, I found excursions running in open trucks and carriages right up to 1872 at least. Because if you're talking about a lot of passengers, they literally didn't have room in their ordinary rolling stock, so they had to make use of goods wagons. I mean, they would make use of a goods wagon that had gone to the quarry all week, and then on the weekend it would be used for excursions without being cleaned. So this is why, again, I find it very frustrating when people have got this image from the Portillo School of Railway History that you sit very tidily in your carriage. There's if you look at the this was Epsom races in 1847, and this was third class. It was fairly unruly, this one.
Sorry.
Carry on.
Is this a collection of 3, isn't it?
It is the bottom one. There's the first and the second, and because there's so few open carriage pictures, and in fact in the Railway Museum there's only one open carriage, so it's actually very rare to see this sort of thing, even though it was very common.
I mean, we've got a question here, if you don't know, from Phil again. Thanks, Phil. On longer trips, how did they manage for toilets, or didn't they?
People always ask that. Well, first, they didn't have any. They had slats in the floor. Don't forget, even if they had a covered carriage, and I mean the alternative was a covered carriage with not really any ventilation. It would probably had a third class would have a tiny window high up, no toilets, no lighting, no heating, and you're literally talking about hours and hours of travel.
Open to the
I imagine at stations a lot of the chaps would just rush out, but it's people always ask that question. The next slide, I think, is a quotation. No, that one. Yeah. This is just. It's interesting when you get this, because you can see exactly what was going on. This was an excursion train from York to Newcastle in 1856, and it describes that the train included 3 third-class open carriages or tubs, only a fit conveyance for pigs and sheep. And even though some people had tickets for a covered carriage, they had to go into open tubs, and they were obliged to travel 85 miles on a wet night, exposed to all the inclemency of the weather. So you're probably talking about 4 hours to get to Newcastle. Now, don't forget that people were used to walking, and they were also used to carts. And I suppose the more wealthy were used to stagecoaches where they might be on top. So it wasn't unheard of to be subject to the elements. But this shows that people were obviously willing to put up with these awful conditions because it was a fast way to travel to somewhere. I think the other element is that people felt dehumanized. They felt like animals when they were in the carriage quite often. And so in fact, sometimes when they were stuck at a cutting, you'd get the people overhead looking at them and mooing and barring at them, and the people in the carriages would start mooing and barring as well, and grunting and bleating. So it was definitely an experience. But then if you look at an open carriage, at least you can see all the way around and you've got fresh air. If you're in one of these little sort of in fact, I've got next one is a picture of one, I think. If you,
yeah.
Oh no, is there another one? Maybe I put them in a different order. What was the one before? That's it. Yeah.
Oh, that's it.
Yes. That shows a rather crowded carriage. You can see what the conditions are like, and very claustrophobic. Mm-hmm. So it may be for some people they actually preferred to be in an open carriage, but it was certainly the devil and the deep blue sea.
Yeah.
I think I've got another possibly. Is there another one?
Come on.
This is a picture that many of you will have seen in Birmingham, and it's a third-class excursion carriage. This one's covered, but it's open at the sides, and you can see that Chappie's got his umbrella there, so it looks pretty cool.
Yeah.
But Brighton and back for 3 and 6. And that's interesting because it's a bit of a mixture of classes, really. Mm. I don't think I would say they were sort of lower middle class and working. Yeah, I would think they were lower middle class rather than working class, actually. And they're on the cheap train.
Yeah.
You quite often find that some people who ought to have known better did travel on the cheap excursions to save money.
Well, that's something you get later on when they start rolling out third class after 1870s. That accusation of the railway companies complaining, they're complaining about people. Well, nobody's going first class anymore or second class. They're all trading downwards. So it's logical to think it happened a bit earlier. So what I like about this is the ironwork on the side. It's slightly ornate.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah. I wonder if that is an indicator of a sort of second class.
Yeah, it does. It does look to me a bit better than ordinary third class. Mm. And as I say, I like the fact that the chap on the left has got a cloth draped over his head, presumably to protect it. It's interesting because quite a lot of these pictures, the chaps are wearing quite tall, what I would regard as a top hat, which looks like a signifier of sort of a higher class. Yeah. But I don't know, not sure about that.
Should we head on next one? Do you want the next one?
Yes.
Oh, hello, Mike. Dr. Asbester is in the room. He's just popped in. Hello, Mike.
Not that one.
Not that one?
No.
That one?
No, that one.
Sorry?
Not that one either.
That one?
That one. I think that's the next one. Yeah. Just to say that's another excursion, an open carriage, and that's South Eastern Railway, obviously Dover by the looks of things. And again, you've got a mixture of different kinds of people. It's showing that there are some covered carriages, but they're in an open one. And that was a piece of music written by Frank Musgrave in it. I think it was 1862 to celebrate this phenomenon, which was so important at that period. Mm-hmm. Right now then. So I think if I've got time, there's just the biggest myth, if you like, that I want to mention was if you go back.
Right.
Oh, that's it. Yeah, stay on there for a bit. Most railway history books talk about Thomas Cook as the inventor of the excursion. And there's a big sigh from me every time I read that, because it just isn't true. He did organise a trip in 1845, and in the 1840s he was obviously at work with a mixture of temperance trips, and then later organised tours. And at that period there were lots of other excursion agents. There was Richard Stanley in Manchester, and there was Henry Marcus in Liverpool, and there was Joseph Crisp. There were a lot of excursion agents. There were a lot of trips going on. We've already mentioned the Sunday school trip in 1831, so I think that could lay claim to be the first excursion, but there was a lot of others. But the reason that Thomas Cook features in railway history books is because he carried on. And he left an archive which people have used. It's generated a lot of research. Obviously, situation's slightly different just at the moment, but it meant that people focused on him because he was the winner, if you like, and they didn't know anything about these other people who didn't leave any business records. The only things that are about them are in the contemporary press. Cook, although he started off running a very cheap trip in 1841, he later on ran organised tours, which took a longer time. They were more expensive, they took a longer time. For instance, the tours that he ran to Scotland. So they were for probably you'd call the lower middle class market, and they weren't the sort of trips that I'm interested in. And there's an interesting point again, I think it was John Walton raised this, was that there's a hierarchy of names for these things. At the bottom is trip, and in the middle is excursion, and then higher up is tour. And it sort of depends what your class is as to what you're going on, really. So the sort of excursion agents that I've been interested in have been one-man businesses, really, working from home. And the one that I've tended to focus on, because in his day it was very important, was Henry Marcus, who was Liverpool-based. He was famous in his day for organising trips for literally hundreds of thousands of people. And he was taken on as excursion agent by the London and North Western Railway in 1846, as soon as they started. And he lasted until 1869. And he promoted trips between London, the Midlands and the North West, offering a lot of different sorts of trips in terms of days and flexibility. And he was very, very popular. He was very good at branding. He branded them as Marcus's cheap excursions. That rather offended LNWR because it was their trains, but people only saw Marcus's name on them. So it rather and it led in eventually to him being dismissed from the contract. So in the first 5 years, he carried 100,000 people, and the staying excursions from London to Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dublin, Bangor, Chester, Birmingham, you name it, all these places. And he, of course, ran trips to the Great Exhibition. He ran trips to the Duke of Wellington in 1852 and the Manchester Art Treasures exhibition in 1857. And it's claimed that he actually carried 1.5 million people in total. So I'm very keen that we look at people. That's great. We look at people like him because he's so important. It was recognised in 1853. He was actually said to be the father of cheap trips, as the late Mr. Stephenson, George Stephenson, was said to be the father of railways. He was so important in his day, but he's just been totally forgotten. And I think these excursion agents built up their reputations as friends of the masses, and they were able to be entrepreneurial, they had marketing skills, they can organise things. They were helped by various factors. The fact that by now there was a single gauge across the rest of all the country, there was a railway clearinghouse, and they discovered that low fares were very appealing to the masses. So it was very attractive, and he actually promoted his trips to the masses. If you show the next one, there, cheap excursion for the working classes, and this one was 1861, and it was from towns like near Barrow to London. I think this was possibly their holiday week in August, because it set off on a Monday and came back the following Monday, and that was 15 shillings return. So he was very successful, but in the end the LNWR dispensed with his services in 1869 because they saw that he was very popular, and they wanted to. They tried to make him have a different arrangement where they employed him directly, but he wasn't having that, so they sacked him basically. And very sadly, he was actually killed by a train in 1875. When he was walking, like a lot of people did, they walked along the railway line, and he was deaf, so he didn't hear the train. So he trod a very uneasy path because he was so successful, but he was totally dependent on the railway company actually continuing this relationship, and they felt threatened, and they could just get rid of him basically. So if people think about the history of railway excursions, I'd like them to think of Henry Marcus.
Yes, I mean, again, this is one of the things I love about your work. It's just these small business people who just had more of an impact in their time than we realise today. It's a good what's the word? It's archival bias, or it's a really good example of
Yes,
that.
indeed.
So and what it always lends me, it raises the question in my mind, and I try and make this clear. What other things are we missing because of these problems? How it's yeah.
Yeah, well, in my book, there's several examples of it. There was a Reverend Brown who organised all sorts of things in London. If I remember right, it was Bethnal Green for the poor of his area, and I'd never heard of him before.
Yeah. Oh, so is that your last slide? I think.
That's my last. I think it's my last slide. Yes.
So yeah, that's really some interesting things to think about. And I think next thing we should do is, if people want to find more, where do they find more?
Yeah, the left-hand one is the book that I produced, and that's got lots more detail about these early railway excursions, and you can get that from either directly from Pen and Sword or order it from bookshops. But the other one is the second book that I produced rather more recently, where the National Railway Museum have got this wonderful archive, the National Archive of Railway Oral History, with lots of interviews with people who have some association with railways, either because they work there or other connections. And I was aware that there were these fascinating interviews with women railway workers, women who were taken on in World War II and doing all sorts of different jobs. Some of them were women's jobs, but a lot of them were what they called men's jobs, like signalling, porters, maintaining the permanent way. And it's absolutely fascinating what they had to say. And basically, the book on the right is actually mostly what these women were saying about their experiences. But I also set it in the context of what was being published about them, both in the press and in railway magazines. In fact, in particularly, well, in both the press and railway magazines, writers were at pains to emphasise their femininity. They couldn't, and they were quite patronising at times about them as well. But I found it quite fascinating. And what's quite wonderful is that one of those people, I mean, they were all quite young in 1940. Discovered, I think it was this year, that one of those people who was a railway guard is actually still alive. And I've been in contact with her recently, and we arranged for her to be filmed by LNER to celebrate VE Day. So that was quite fascinating.
Oh, lovely. Oh, that's great.
I was glad it's Scarlet.
I think I would recommend them both. So I think I should say, Susan, I think we should give a shout out to the publication that's come out this week that we're both in.
Yes, yes.
So, this is just come out, and I edited it. It's an edited collection. And if you have £96 academic text, do like that. And Mike, who's also in the room as well, he's contributed on railway accidents. And Susan, you've got something on St Monday and Sabbatarianism and influences on excursions, and I've got something on brewing, unsurprisingly. So that's out there if you've got a lot of money to burn. So, Susan, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for a really interesting talk. We have got one question, maybe you know it, from Gunnar. Do you know the average speed of trains?
People say that. Well, don't forget, if you're talking about excursion trains, they used to have to stop. I would say possibly on a longer journey about 25 miles an hour. But don't forget, an excursion to let regular traffic go through. So you might know the speed, but it was stopping a lot. So a lot of these excursions took a hell of a long time.
Okay. I think it varied. Yeah, it's not easy to judge. So I suppose you could try and work it out from newspaper reports. It left it some, yeah. So anyhow. So next time, everybody.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Sorry.
Thank you very much for inviting me on.
No worries. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much. And just to plug next time, so firstly, go and buy the books. They're available on Pen and Sword website, and I put a link in the comments as well. Next time we have Dr. David Rooney, who's going to be, well, we're departing for the first time from railways. We're going to be talking about flyovers and empires from Canning Town to Rome. So he's going to be talking about, well, the Canning Town flyover. And I know it's probably not sounding particularly, it's really fascinating because we had him at the seminar at the Institute of Historical Research talk about how flyovers can be much more than just a means of transport. So that's next time. And once again, thank you so much, Susan. It's been absolutely fantastic. And well, everybody, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for coming. It's been really great. Thank you for your questions and comments. And yes, well, see you next time. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.